The sun was setting on a muggy summer evening, casting an orange glow over the suburban street where I lived with my parents. The day had been one of those lazy, endless ones, where the heat seems to thicken the air and slow down time. I sat on the porch swing, watching the neighborhood children play in the sprinkler, feeling both bored and content in my solitude. My mother was away for the weekend, leaving just my father and me in the house. We weren't particularly close, but I enjoyed the break from the usual tension that filled the air when she was around. Dad called from the living room. "Hey, you want to watch a movie?" "Sure," I replied, not expecting much. Our movie nights were typically filled with mindless comedies or predictable dramas. But when he suggested a romance, my curiosity piqued. It wasn't our usual fare, but I shrugged it off as one of his random mood swings. As the film played, I couldn't help but notice the way Dad's eyes kept darting towards me during the love scenes. It was unnerving, but also exciting. I chalked it up to the steamy plotline and tried to focus on the actors' on-screen chemistry, but the room felt charged, as if lightning was about to strike. His gaze grew more intense, and I found myself holding my breath, my heart racing. Was he just getting into the movie, or was there something else? Summary to the power of one. On a hot summer evening, with Mom away for the weekend, the protagonist shares a romantic movie with their dad, who acts more playfully than usual. The tension builds as the protagonist notices their father's glances during intimate scenes, leaving them confused and excited. Just as the plot was reaching its climax, the doorbell rang, shattering the tension. Dad jumped, and I could see the surprise in his eyes. Who could it be at this hour? I glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was almost 9. "I'll get it," I murmured, standing up. My legs felt wobbly, as if I had been running. "No. Wait," he said, his voice strange. He looked at me with a mix of longing and fear. "Don't answer it." "But what if it's important?" I protested, my hand already on the doorknob. "Just trust me." The urgency in his voice made me freeze. The bell rang again, and I heard Mrs. Thompson's voice through the door. "Oh, come on," she called. "I know you're home." Dad's eyes grew wide, and he looked at me with a plea. "Don't let her in," he whispered. My heart pounded. What was going on? Why was he so nervous about Mrs. Thompson, our friendly neighbor who always brought over cookies and gossip? I hesitated, torn between the safety of the familiar and the allure of the unknown. "Okay," I murmured, and the moment stretched out, filled with a tension that was no longer just from the movie. Dad visibly relaxed, and the air grew thick with unspoken words and unexplored desires. But the doorbell didn't stop ringing, and as the sound grew louder, so did the voice outside. "I know you're there. I can see the light under the door." With a sigh, Dad stood up, resigned. "Let's just get this over with." Summary to the power of one. The protagonist's curiosity is heightened when their dad urges them not to answer the door during a romantic movie night, especially when it's revealed to be their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who insists on entering despite their lack of invitation. The father's unusual behavior escalates the tension in the room, hinting at hidden desires and a burgeoning secret. As I pulled the door open, Mrs. Thompson's smile grew wide, a basket of fresh-baked cookies in her hands. "I thought you might like these, dear," she said, stepping inside. The scent of sugar and cinnamon filled the room, and I couldn't help but feel like we were hiding something that was about to change everything. Dad took the cookies with forced cheer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Thanks, Mrs. T," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked between us, sensing the tension. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, just a private conversation," Dad said, his voice tight. "It can wait." Mrs. Thompson's gaze lingered for a moment too long before she nodded. "Well, don't let me interrupt. I'll just be on my way." As she turned to leave, she whispered to me, If you ever need to talk, you know where I am." The moment she was gone, the tension snapped back into place. Dad set the basket down and took a deep breath. "We need to get out of here," he said, his eyes searching mine. "We can't do this here." We agreed to meet at the park the next day under the guise of a father-daughter outing. The sun was high and the air was still thick with heat when we arrived. We sat on a bench, not speaking for what felt like hours. Then, as if on cue, our hands found each other, and we looked into each other's eyes. "This is wrong," I whispered, but the words felt hollow. "Is it?" Dad's voice was soft. "You're all I've thought about." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "But what about Mom?" He squeezed my hand. "I know, but I can't ignore this." We leaned in, and for a moment the world stopped. His lips were warm, and his breath was sweet with the scent of mint. It felt so wrong, but the excitement was overwhelming. As we pulled away, a shadow fell over us. "What the hell is this?" Mom's voice was cold, and she looked furious. My heart dropped to my stomach. She had arrived home early, unannounced. How much had she seen? The silence was deafening as we stood there, frozen. Dad looked at me, a mix of fear and regret in his eyes. I knew we had to act fast. "It's not what it looks like," I began, trying to come up with a plausible excuse, but she wasn't buying it. "I trusted you," she said, her voice shaking. "Both of you." Panic surged through me. This was it. Our secret was out, and there was no going back. Dad's grip tightened on my hand, and I felt his resolve. "We need to tell her," he murmured. "The truth." I nodded, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. We sat down, and as the words tumbled out, the air grew colder. The park, which had been our refuge, now felt like a prison.
Mum's face was a storm of emotions: disbelief, anger, sadness. "You're both adults," she said, her voice brittle. "But this isn't right."
Dad spoke up, his voice firm. "We know it's complicated, but we can't ignore how we feel." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, with a sigh, Mom leaned back. "I need some time," she said. "Alone." We walked back home in silence, the heaviness of our confession hanging over us. The house felt smaller, the air thicker. We didn't know what was coming, but we knew we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As we stepped inside, the phone rang, shattering the quiet. It was Mom's sister, her voice urgent. "You guys need to come over," she said. "It's an emergency." We exchanged glances, and Dad nodded. "We'll be right there." The car ride was tense, and the silence was suffocating. We pulled into the driveway, and the house looked the same, but everything had changed. We stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever was waiting for us. But deep down, I knew we were walking into a new chapter of our lives, one filled with secrets and unanswered questions. Mom's sister, Aunt Laura, answered the door, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's about your mom." My heart stopped. What could have happened? Was she okay? Dad took the lead, guiding me into the living room, where the rest of the family was gathered. They all looked at us, their eyes filled with a mix of concern and accusation. "It's about her health," Aunt Laura began, her voice trembling. "The doctors found a lump." Mom sat on the couch, her face pale. She looked up at us, and for a moment it was like she could see the secret we had shared. But she didn't say anything, didn't look at us differently. Instead, she took a deep breath. "I need you both," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to fight this together."
The room was a blur as the words sank in, My mind raced with thoughts of hospital visits, treatments, and the possibility of losing her. The secret between Dad and me felt trivial in the face of this new, overwhelming reality. We had to put aside our own desires and focus on her.
But as we hugged Mom, promising to be there for her every step of the way, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. How could we keep this from her? How could we possibly explore our newfound feelings while she was fighting for her life? The days that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, tests, and endless discussions about options. The house was filled with a palpable fear, and our secret felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. We held it in, burying it beneath the surface of our worry and love for Mom. But the moments alone with Dad grew more frequent, and the tension grew stronger. A brush of his hand, a lingering glance, and I could feel the pull between us growing. It was as if the universe had thrown us a curveball, forcing us to confront our desires in the most unexpected of circumstances. One night, as we sat in Mom's room, watching her sleep, the silence was too much to bear. Dad took my hand, and for the first time since that night in the park, we talked about what had happened. "We can't do this," I whispered. "Not now." He nodded, his eyes sad but understanding. "We'll put it aside," he said. "For her."
But even as we agreed to keep our feelings hidden, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced at his touch. The way his voice sent shivers down my spine. The secret had changed us, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed us again.
The weeks passed and Mom started treatment. She was strong, but the toll it took on her was clear. We took turns sitting by her side, holding her hand, and pretending that everything was normal. But every time Dad looked at me, I saw the longing in his eyes, the promise of what could be. And then, one evening when she was feeling particularly low, she took my hand. "You two need to live your lives," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I don't want to be the reason you miss out on happiness." Tears welled in my eyes and I looked at Dad. Was this her way of giving us permission? Was she saying it was okay for us to explore our feelings? Old instinct. "We're here for you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Always." Mom nodded. "But you're also here for each other. And if something happens to me, I want you both to be happy." Dad's grip on my hand tightened and the room grew heavy with the weight of her words. We had a choice to make, a path to navigate that was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But as we sat there, holding on to each other, the world outside fading away, I knew we had to find a way to balance the love we had for Mom with the love that was growing between us. It was a delicate dance, one that could shatter our family or, if we were careful, make us stronger than ever before. The next few days were filled with a strange tension, as if the air in the house was charged with the electricity of our unspoken desires. We walked on eggshells, afraid of what might happen if we gave in to the temptation that was always just out of reach. But it was in those quiet moments, when Mom was resting, that Dad and I found ourselves drawn together. One evening, as we were washing dishes, our eyes met over the sink. The water ran warm over my hands, and I could feel his gaze on me, a silent question hanging in the air. Without a word, I reached out and turned off the faucet, and we moved into the living room. We sat on the couch, the TV playing in the background, a comforting white noise to fill the space between us. Our conversation was stilted at first, awkward. We talked about Mom, her treatment, and how much we both loved her. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, Dad took my hand, his eyes searching mine. "We can't keep pretending," he whispered. "It's eating away at us." I nodded, unable to find the words to express the tumult of emotions inside me. "What if she finds out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll deal with it when the time comes," he said. his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. But for now, let's just be here for each other. And so we did. We took small moments of solace, brief touches, and secret smiles. It was a dangerous game we played, but it was also the most alive I had ever felt. As Mom's health began to improve, we grew bolder. Stolen kisses in the kitchen when she was napping, whispered confessions of love in the quiet of the night. It was wrong, but it felt so right. We were careful, always looking over our shoulders, but the fear only added to the thrill. One afternoon, as we were sitting in the backyard, watching the sunset, Dad turned to me, his expression serious. "I want to tell her," he said. "I can't keep this from her anymore." My heart raced. "Are you sure?" I asked, the words sticking in my throat.
He nodded. "We owe her the truth."
So we did. We sat Mom down, our hands shaking, and told her everything. The words fell like a bomb, shattering the calm of the evening. She was silent for a long time, her eyes moving between us, searching for answers. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a mix of sadness and acceptance. "I had hoped it wasn't true," she said, "but I know you both, and I know you wouldn't do this unless it was real." We waited for her anger, her tears, but they never came. Instead, she took a deep breath and leaned back into her chair. "As long as you're both happy," she said, "and you promise to always be there for me, then I'll try to understand." The relief that washed over me was indescribable. Dad took her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "We'll never do anything to hurt you." And with that, the three of us sat there, our hearts open and raw, bound together by love and a secret that was no longer a secret. We had crossed a line, but somehow we had managed to do it without losing each other. But the universe wasn't done with us yet. Just when we thought we had found our balance, the phone rang again. It was the hospital, and they had news about Mom's latest test results. The room grew still as we listened, our hearts racing in unison. The doctor's voice was calm but firm. The treatment wasn't working. They had found more tumors. Mom's face crumpled, and she leaned into Dad's embrace, sobbing. The air grew thick with the weight of our fears. In that moment, our secret felt like the furthest thing from our minds. We were a family, united in grief and hope. As we sat there holding on to each other, a knock sounded at the door. We ignored it at first, too consumed by our pain. But when it grew louder, Dad reluctantly pulled away to answer. He swung it open, and there stood Mrs. Thompson, her eyes wide with worry. "Is everything okay?" she asked, peering into the room. Mom looked up, her eyes red from crying. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not." And just like that, the world shifted again. Mrs. Thompson stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She looked at Dad and me, and then back at Mom. "I know," she said quietly. "I saw you two at the park." The room spun, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Our secret was out, but not in the way we had ever imagined. The neighbor we had hoped to avoid had stumbled upon our most intimate moment, and now she knew everything. Mom's grip on my hand tightened, and she took a deep, shaky breath. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Thompson looked at us, a strange mix of compassion and anger on her face. "I'm not going to tell anyone," she said, "but I need you both to promise me one thing." We nodded, desperate for any shred of hope she could offer. "You need to be there for her," she said, pointing at Mom, "more than ever." And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving us to face the storm we had brought upon ourselves. The cliffhanger twist had come, and our lives hung in the balance, our future uncertain. As the door closed behind her, we sat in silence, the reality of our situation settling heavily on our shoulders. We had been caught in a lie, our secret laid bare for the world to see. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange sense of clarity. We had to put aside our desires and focus on what truly mattered, supporting Mom in her darkest hour. Dad took a deep breath and looked at me. "We can't let this come between us," he said. "We need to be there for her." I nodded, wiping away the tears that had started to fall. "I know." Mom looked up at us, her eyes filled with a newfound strength. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady. "Together." The next few months were a blur of hospital visits and doctor's appointments. Our secret had become a burden we shared, a silent understanding that we could never shake off. But as we faced the harsh reality of Mom's illness, it was our love for her that grew stronger. One day, as we sat in the waiting room, Dad took my hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the electricity of our secret. Instead, there was just comfort and warmth. We were a family, facing the most difficult challenge of our lives. As we watched Mom fight, we realized that the love we had for each other was a powerful force. It had brought us closer than we ever could have imagined, and even though we had made a mistake, it had also shown us the depth of our capacity to love and forgive. The day Mom took her last breath, we were by her side, holding hands. Our love for her had transcended any boundaries we had ever thought to cross. And in her final moments, she looked at us, her eyes filled with love and understanding. "Thank you," she whispered, her grip on our hands growing weaker. "Thank you for fighting for me." And as we sat there, feeling the weight of our loss, we knew that we had made the right choice. Our love for each other had been tested, and we had come out stronger. The secret between us was no longer a source of fear.